The Teachers Guild of New South Wales acknowledges the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, of the Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters throughout Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Frederick Osmond. As the President of the Teachers Guild of New South Wales, I would like to thank you for joining us for our Guild Education Series on the topic today, Decline in Literacy. What do we need to do now and how do we do it? It is my great pleasure to be joined by a distinguished panel to discuss this important education topic more broadly. Our panel this evening includes Maxine Borg, Teacher Inclusive and Diverse Education Teacher, St Paul's Catholic College, Denise Ritchie, Honorary Chair of the Literacy and Fellow, Literacy Specialist, the Thras Institute, and Patrick Nam from Loreto Kirribilli and the Teachers Guild of New South Wales Vice President, who will be moderating this event. Thank you for our panel for joining us today.
Thank you.
For some housekeeping, please feel free to share your experiences, thoughts, and questions in the chat function and pose any questions to the panel through the Q&A box on the Zoom control panel. Please keep your Q&A questions short and relevant to the topic on what we are talking about today. Our host will moderate and will tend to ask questions during our discussion panel. Thank you, Maxine, Denise, and Patrick for joining us today.
Thank you, Fred. Well, before we begin, Maxine and Denise, if you wouldn't mind just explaining a little bit about yourself and what you do in your field of expertise. So let's start off with Maxine.
Hi, everyone. I'm a teacher by trade for many decades now, and I'm a high school teacher. I started out teaching maths and geography. I then had a bit of a break to have family and found my way back, very fortunately, into what I've now had multiple job titles. I think it was special ed when I first started. I've been a learning support teacher, a diverse learning teacher, a teacher of inclusion. I've had a lot of job titles, but one of the things I learnt very early on working in the space around inclusion and diversity was that many of the children who struggled, particularly when they got to high school with curriculum access, were really struggling because literacy was the barrier to their access to the curriculum. And so I went and did a lot of retraining about how to teach kids to read. I read, I went to conferences. Denise should be interested to know I did my Thras training many years ago. And I guess it's been my greatest passion, particularly being in a high school in the years that follow, to keep talking about the fact that we often say, you know, literacy across the curriculum, everyone's a teacher of literacy, but I think the conversation today is really about what does that look like in the hours that we've got with students at school, what we're assigning at home, what we're making priorities, and particularly in a time when we're going through the biggest curriculum reform around the corner ever in New South Wales, and the work that NESA are doing around new syllabus documents, and how I'm wondering how that will play out in terms of what that will look, how different that will look at the coalface for students. So I often reflect that I've often been in schools where I was the only person in a high school who knew how to teach reading, but I've worked as a consultant for quite a few years, where I wondered how confident many young teachers were in those early years to make sure students were confident and proficient with those foundational literacy skills. So I guess my introductory comment is literacy is a lot of things. Reading, writing, and all the other things, that the big five that make up reading, but to be literate in a modern time, I think is going to lead us to a really interesting discussion this afternoon. So thank you.
And Denise.
And I'm absolutely there with you, Maxine, on everything that you've said. And my name obviously is Denise Ritchie, and I'm the Chair of Literacy at Murdoch University. As with Maxine, teaching is also my trade. I've taught for many, many years. I've worked in universities. I've worked in schools, I've worked in secondary schools, I've worked in primary schools, I've worked overseas, and I've done a lot of work with ESL as well. So I've sort of seen English in lots of its different variations and how we teach literacy right from the start, whether or not we're working with children who've got disabilities, whether or not we're working with adults who are starting off on this literacy process, where we're starting children on this literacy process, or where English is a second or other language. And I think that, as Maxine said, we all know that to be literate is the cornerstone of all learning. And if we don't build those literacy skills early in our early learning, then we then start to see where children struggle in this process. So it's really important that we get it right from the very beginning. And getting it right, I think there's a lot out there at the moment where people are polarizing lots of our work that we do in schools, and polarizing the way that teachers should be feeling about teaching literacy from the very start. But from my perspective, I think now, and this is, I'm sure Maxine's with me as well, from teaching for many, many years, is that we keep seeing this circle circle that's going around of let's use this process to teach, or let's use this process to teach. Whereas I think it's about time now, when we're in 2022 and beyond, that we're actually looking at what is the balance that we need to have, that there is no actual one way to teach children literacy. There are lots and lots of processes that come into play, and they're all integrated, they're all interrelated skills. And if we don't get all those skills right, then we are just going to continue these generations of children who are going to struggle in learning in becoming literate.
No, look, I agree with you in that. And on that note, to start off our first question for the evening is, what are the major changes to literacy practices that have been affected by the increase in the use of technology within classes these days? What's something that you perhaps have noticed that may have either affected, or has it been a detriment, or has it been an advantage to a certain extent?
Maxine?
Yeah, I don't think it matters if it's seen as an advantage or a disadvantage. It's a reality. This technology is here to stay. So I think rather than having that debate, we need to talk about how do we utilize it while we're still, as educators, explicitly teaching and modeling and promoting the foundational skills to being able to read. So it doesn't matter sometimes how whiz bang things are, but there are plenty out there. I think the technology's been, there's a few things in terms of kids who are struggling to read as they get older. The world of assistive technologies is just the biggest bonus. I look at, kids who couldn't read proficiently as they moved through the years of schooling previously, didn't have a lot of the assistive technologies. So I've been in classrooms, and I've actually just set up a literacy program at a school where one of the early things we did was got the students to install some Chrome extensions, Read and Write, Grammarly. Why? These tools are there, and they're there to support, not replace being functionally literate. And I think there can be some misconceptions around that. I think there's a lot of platforms on the market about teaching reading. So the world of apps is massive. And I think it's important to unpack what's the need, what are we doing it for, and therefore which tools are great for this. Many of those online platforms have built in some of the great principles of gamification that, as a teacher, I wish I had. The bells and whistles, the noises, the rewards, the built-in hints, all of the things that gamers know give kids enough motivation to come back and try again. And so I think assistive technologies, online learning platforms that can be incredibly personalised and targeted, provide great feedback, great direction. I think this is the world we're living in. So how do we not just try and buy everything, but find the ones that are really evidence-based, giving us good feedback about students' progress? So if it's to enhance the literacy skills, reading and writing, whatever that might be, of students who are already proficient at an age level, or to help students catch up who are falling behind in terms of their literacy skills. It's about the right tools for the right area of need, not just here's a new thing, it looks great, let's give it a go. Because if a child's struggling to be functionally literate, good guessing is not the business we're in as educators. It's knowing what the area of need is within that big thing that we call literacy, and then targeting that explicitly and with a lot of focus so they can catch up.
Sorry.
Denise, did you want to add anything to that?
No, after you've spoken, Patrick, I was actually just going to say I totally agree with where you are, and I think one of the most important things is that we have to know that we can't go backwards. It's all about going forwards, and how we make a balance of how we use these processes in our schools. And I think that's really important that we think about as teachers, that we've got each of these, and it's important where Maxine's coming from, especially where we need the assisted learning tools for children who really struggle in different ways. I think one of the biggest things, if I'm talking about a lot of mainstream work that we have to do, is one of the elements that I find that's really missing now, that is very hard when we're going into technology, is that we need to focus on handwriting. And I think that is one of our big elements that we've actually let slip over the years. And I think for some of us, because we spend so much time in technology, we think that having keyboarding skills is the same as us being able to have handwriting skills. Handwriting underpins everything that we do in early literacy. And because to be able, first of all, to understand what our alphabet looks like, but to be able to write that alphabet is absolutely imperative. And if a child is able to physically write a letter and then be able to know what that letter is, that's a very important part of what we do. And as we start to learn those letters, we can then start to see how those letters come together to represent what we call the phonic patterns in words, and how those phonic patterns actually develop words. So handwriting actually underpins the whole process that we need for reading. And we know that the studies that are coming out now show very, very clearly that children who are, or I should say teachers who focus on spelling as an element and put a lot of focus on spelling, actually, so the encoding process, not the decoding process, but are focusing on that encoding process, we actually see we are getting greater results in comprehension than where people are actually just focusing on the decoding process. So that comes from what we need with handwriting, and handwriting being a specific skill. And I think that for me is one of the areas that I see when I go into schools from my perspective, where I see that we're letting our learners down. And that is not that we should only be doing handwriting, we should be doing both. But I think we always have to focus on that process, that, hitting an A on a keyboard is very different to me being able to actually draw an A or write an A and know what that is. And then, of course, as we move through the school, progressively go through the school for note taking, going, and we're having an earlier discussion on, it's important when we even get to our university levels where we're writing our notes, and that whole process of handwriting and taking that information into our brains, it's really important. I don't know, but for me, myself, when I sit down and I'm taking notes, just as I'm scribbling and while I'm talking to people, I don't even actually have to read those notes again. It's because I've written them down that I've got that pathway that makes it easy for me to go back and to access that information. And I think that's something that we really have to focus on when we're talking now about where literacy is falling down. And I find that one of the big things that I find, and it'll be interesting to see what Maxine says here, is now that we have changed, we've got a very changed focus in early literacy and the way we think about children. On one hand, we've got these highly computer literate children who come into our classrooms, who can use mobile phones, who are able to use iPads and so forth. But when they come into school and we're teaching them literacy skills, reading and writing, we actually don't believe that children have those abilities. And so we're dumbing down our curriculum, the way we teach children right from the very beginning. And I think that that's something that we really have to address. And I think to me, that is one of the elements that we really have to think about very, very carefully, about how do children learn. And from my perspective, and I'm taking for all my years of teaching, and I believe very strongly in all the groups, you know, where I have taught, is that children do not learn in a linear way. You know, it's all big picture learning. Excuse me. You know, we need to see the big picture where we're going. We start from this big picture and we pull them apart and we come back into those small pictures to see how it's all put together. And unfortunately, lots of our learning at the moment seems to be going to, let's have a very linear process in learning. We're starting from these little pictures, and then all of a sudden I'll give you enough that you can put together to make a big picture. And I think that the way that we're teaching literacy now is actually detrimental to the way that many children learn to read. And it also doesn't allow me as a teacher to be able to differentiate for my learners, because, you know, I'm putting all my learners in the same basket. So whether or not I'm a learner who needs more time to learn that process and to have much more repetition of that process, or whether or not I'm a learner who needs to be extended, my children who need to be extended are actually being kept in a box down here. My children who need more of are not getting what they need because they have to keep up with this middle process. So I think that's something we really have to think about as teachers as we move forward.
And on to that note, Maxine, I might ask you this question, because Denise just briefly mentioned about curriculum and implementing literacy into the curriculum. What are the best ways teachers can assess whether a program is good or not? What's something that you would look for when you look at a course or a program or unit of work?
It depends what age the student's at and who the teacher is, but I just think baseline is that kind of message that, you know, for the first 3 years you come to school, you come to learn to read, and then for the remainder of school, you read to learn. Now, for most children, you know, I think it's 85%, kids will learn to read despite the instructional quality of the program or the person at the front of the room or the online learning platform. So we're really talking about what's a fairly marginal, but an incredibly vulnerable group of students who are going to continue to progress through their years at schooling. And so early intervention's the obvious answer. And I think it's really first and foremost about good assessment, the diagnosing what is it about literacy that they're struggling with. So I'll make a few points. Firstly, dyslexia, great word, love that it's phonetically spelt. But I would make, I knew you'd laugh at that, Denise, but I will make the point that from my perspective as someone who's worked in special needs, learning support, whatever, for many years, it effectively means to me, I've got a student in my class or in my school who's a low progress reader. So my job is to work out what is it about reading they're finding difficult, and then work on remediating that. I think, you know, the basic things about good phonics instruction, explicit instruction, and I'll just refer everyone listening to a few things that I've learned over the years that I've found really useful. Lorraine Hammond, who you might know, she comes out of a university in Western Australia as well, but she talks about the fact that often children who are struggling, we go slower and we give them less to do. But what we should be doing is giving them more to do and do it faster, but at a functional level. Now, I hope you re-quote that because I'm re-quoting her and acknowledging that she said that. So that's often one of the problems. I think assistive technologies have a place to play there. I'll also refer you to an organisation called CAST, C-A-S-T. They do some really great work around, if you're looking for an assistive technology, a tool, an app, what's the criteria you go to? So people often say, what's a good app? And I'll go, well, it depends what you want it to do. What do you need it for? So CAST, they're really good. I'd really want to also mention one other article that I've referred to and used over and over again. It's called How Do Children Learn? Denise, I don't know if you've read it. It's an article that's a little bit old now by Stella Voznadu. Yes, but it's a great article about how kids learn to read. So if any of you are going away and think I'll do an hour of my accredited reading, it's an absolute cracker piece of writing. And I'll just finish this section by saying, Denise, I agree around the handwriting and the cognitive and metacognitive processes when you're scribbling all over your notes, as I was doing while you were talking. I just want to add to that, it's not just about writing, it's about sustained writing for me. I'm increasingly noticing that that students, particularly teenagers, right through high school, find it very difficult to sustain a long period of time where they write. I've done activities around lightning writing or stimulus material where just to write for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, let alone 3 hours, as we do in New South Wales HSC exams, is really quite a challenge. And I've just finished reading a great book by Johann Hari, who I love, who's written a book called Stolen Focus. And I think just the attention span that the world of digital technologies and social media platforms and all of those things have had a big influence on that capacity, not just handwriting, but sustained handwriting. I know that's a lot of things, but just to, I guess, link back to your point about handwriting and how.
And I think that was a very good point. You know, where we bring up about sustained handwriting, and I think this is one of the things that we're seeing now. I mean, handwriting itself is a motor skill. And as it's a fine motor skill, but like with any motor skill, it has to be practiced, and we have to build up that muscular structure that for us to be able to do that, to be able to carry out that process. And so if we're not practicing that with our learners, and you know, if they're not practicing it daily and doing sustained writing daily, then you know, when they do have to write, they actually don't have that skill to be able to write. And that's why, you know, I see lots of the secondary kids that I work with, I think it's hilarious, and they go, but it makes my hand hurt so much. And I go, of course it makes your hand hurt. You know, like, I don't like doing this, it makes my hand hurt. And, you know, they laugh because I always say, well, why do you think I've got a big lump on my finger here? Because I've spent so much time with balancing my pen here and having to write. I said, it's a really important skill that we do, but it's something you have to practice. It's no different if I want to be, you know, great at soccer and be able to kick a ball, or footy and kick a ball, or whatever. It's a motor skill, and it has to be practiced over and over.
But Patrick, I think you would agree that most teachers are really cognizant of the fact that they need to allocate time to writing and being away from devices.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that, and I think it's quite important. I mean, my field is music, and so writing is essential. And obviously, in our context, it would be composing. And so when we're trying to get the students to write, they do start to veer off, and we want them to get their ideas down on paper first before they start moving on to using the software that's there to assist them, right? Like you said, it's a tool to help them realize what they're trying to compose onto a piece of music in terms of music. So, there's a question that I've always wondered. Is it really, to what extent, or as they say, the rise of children's personal electronic devices, does that kind of create the fall of literacy? What do you think?
I think that would be a simplification of something much more complex.
Yeah,
it's a nice, easy solution, isn't it? This caused this. In a world where I just don't think it's that simple. But, you know, all the research is going to direct you back to pre-service teacher training.
And to what extent do you think social media and other digital technologies has perhaps influenced in the decline in literacy?
Actually, if I can answer, I think that when we're talking about devices and social media and so forth, really, we're talking about the declining literacy. To be able to access social media and Facebook and so forth, you have to be able to read. You know, that's a really important thing. You can't do that without reading, and you can't comprehend. You need to be able to have the emotional and social ability to be able to comprehend what you're reading if you're going to be going on those platforms. I think one of the things that we do see, and I think when we're talking about the literacy decline, is we don't see as much of, and I'm saying, and making a very wide sweeping statement here, but across the board, I've actually seen people reading books as much as what we would before, because a lot of people read on devices, or they spend a lot more time reading news on devices, or like you said, going onto social media platforms, which they wouldn't before. And some people who might have sat down and read a book in previous times might sit down, instead of spending an hour reading a book, be actually working on social media for an hour, or being involved in social media. So it's really interesting how that plays out, because I don't really think that is the problem that we actually have with where we're actually heading in literacy. at the moment. I think there's a lot more deeper elements that we have to deal with before we can sort of say, start to blame anything on technology.
So why do you think there's been a decline in literacy? Or what do you think has occurred then, if you're thinking on your lines along going on with your statement there of how you think it's obviously a much broader picture than technology itself? Where do you think we can't really say the origins of it, but why has there been a literacy decline?
From my, sorry, go on, you go, Maxine.
Please, you go, Denise.
No, I mean, I've got my own very strong views on what our literacy decline is, and I think one of them is coming back to, we used that word explicit teaching beforehand. I think that we have moved away from a very full literacy program to a lot of work, and I go back. We've had decades now, especially the last 20 years, where there's been so many Blackline Masters and fill-in worksheets that children do. I think that's one of the elements that, and I know it sounds a very simple one, but a lot of our learning to read and so forth is only filling in missing parts, so instead of children having to write sentences or fill in missing parts of words. And I think that's sort of a decline that sort of happened, that sort of got out of our hands in a way. And I think, we go back and, we talk about where children would be doing a lot of note taking from boards, but writing a lot. Whereas we made that big change from that to, we only have to do filling little parts. And I think that we then started with a lot of that whole type of thing with a lot of worksheets with fill in close activities. And I think then coming back down to with teacher training and coming back to what Maxine was going to say about what we do in teacher training, I think then the whole process that happens there is that teachers go out and I've got very strong views about that, especially working since I've worked a lot with teachers, and we had a very funny discussion the other day, because a lot of people say, oh, I didn't learn this in teacher training, or I didn't learn this in teacher training. And yet we were discussing about an assignment that we had to do, and the assignment was actually on the Scarborough reading ropes. And this person, we were talking in this group, said, oh, we didn't do Scarborough reading ropes. And when we looked and said, well, actually, you actually did an assignment on the Scarborough reading ropes. The hardest thing about being a student and going through this in university is that actually you don't actually know what you're there for. And I say to my students all the time, we're actually giving you answers now to problems that you don't know that you're going to have. And until you actually get into the classroom and start to embrace those problems, and you've got those problems in front of you, then actually it's very, very difficult for us to be able to work around those problems. So, there is a lot of stuff that goes into teacher training. And as we know, teacher training now is very different to, when I went through teacher training, I had the absolute luxury of going to a teacher college, where we went from 9 o'clock in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was all about teaching and methodology and so forth. Now, some of our students might take 3, 4 years, 5 years to do a teaching degree, and a lot of that might even be done like this on Zoom. They might not even attend lectures. They might, where there is not as much professional, there's not as many practicums that many student teachers go out to. So there's lots of elements there that are actually causing us to have difficulties that we have to navigate through now. And I don't think it's as easy as blaming one group or another group and saying, no, we don't do this in teacher training, or we haven't done this, or this hasn't been done. Because I don't think we're ever going to be able to go back into teacher training unless we say, okay, let's go back and do it how we did many years ago about having teachers' colleges, or no, you can't do a degree in teaching because we want you there, because we have to make sure that you're at every lecture, and you have to be there from 9 to 5 each day. So, we've got to navigate all those elements. And I don't think it's anything about going back and putting the blame in those areas. I think it's how we're going to have to work through, like our technology and so forth as well, is how we have to navigate these areas and say, what does the future look like?
And Maxine, did you want to add anything to that?
Just clearly, any pre-service program for primary or infants teachers has to have a significant component about how to teach teach children to read so that those people can confidently go into schools. And I think one of the challenges is, like everything, there are so many other competing agendas, and I'm sure we've all been exposed to the many, you know, the funny things going around about what a teacher's job is, but it's a crowded agenda. And the review into the curriculum in New South Wales showed us that it's overcrowded. Who's going to decide what doesn't stay in, so we can have more depth and less breadth, whatever that's going to look like? But that's one of the big challenges. But if there's anything that would be a non-negotiable in a pre-service course, and all the literature you read around it is that that's an important starting place. And of course, we're going to go back to before someone gets in a school to say they've got to know how to teach reading. But I think more importantly, I think it's done in many university courses for primary teachers. A lot of it's about the confidence with all the things that are sitting around the instruction, a good phonics-based program. I also just want to make the point that declining literacy is a relative term. It's a decline relative based on NAPLAN data, which, you know, anyone sitting in this webinar will know we don't get a lot of time to unpack and really tease out about our individual students. And you're nodding because you're teaching a language in a subject where there's a whole language in music. I have a daughter who learnt to read music before she could read proficiently. So I really think that everyone's on board with that. But the relative decline, I think, also comes with things like international results compare, where PISA is used to, I guess, see like schools or like nations. So it's never one simple thing. It's not about saying there's a decline because of this. Certainly there's going to be an impact of technology. There's going to be an impact because of pre-service courses for teachers. There's going to be an impact of overcrowded syllabus. There's going to be an impact of, you know, we could run off a list of a lot of things, but it doesn't change the fact that our business is about quality differentiated teaching instruction. That's our job. That's our core business, and the conversation has to be, how do we deliver that so that when we say we're all teachers of literacy, what will that look like when I walk into a classroom? What does that look like if someone walks into my school? How will they know? How will they know we're a school that's inclusive? How will they know we're a school that does literacy across the curriculum? And what things will I see happening in a classroom? So, you know, big things these days are learning intentions and success criteria. And Denise, I'm not saying you're as old as me, but I kind of think it's just new lingo for another good thing. Let the kids in on the secret of what the lesson's for, and how will they know they've done well?
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's so important. But one of the other things that, you know, and it's a really important for me element to come back into as well. And I think that with governments, I'd like to see, especially in, you know, sort of going into the government sector here, is that and across all sectors, obviously, but is that professional learning. I don't really think that we do enough solid professional learning once teachers leave, once they leave initial teacher education. Because what actually happens is people don't realise that your learning is continuing. And I get that with a lot of teachers, and I go, but, you know, you're just starting your journey now. And professional learning is so important, you know, that ongoing professional learning. And you know, you didn't learn everything in uni. There's no way in the world you could learn everything in university. You can't. But if, you know, we've got to really get that mindset that professional learning is really important, and that ongoing professional learning is really important, and that ongoing professional learning. And that was really important what Maxine said about us being able to analyse and be diagnostic on what happens in our classroom. And, you know, and I go into so many schools where, you know, they've given a test, but nobody is actually analysing what that test is, and they're not being diagnostic. It's not going, well, what's that show me? What do I do? What do I now have to go back and do? So, you know, you can go to a school and you get any of these, you know, all this amazing testing that's happening. And what it might only give you is a child's reading age or a child's spelling age, if you're giving a South Australian spelling test or whatever. And they'll come out with an age, but the age really is really nonsensical, because you might see a child who's written a word they might write a word like anxiety, and they might write as ANGZIETY. And actually that child is showing me that they've got excellent orthography, they've got great phonic understanding, they can sound these words out, they've got really good memory because they can put those number of sounds in a row. But then that child gets marked with a big cross and they get put in a remedial class. Now, that's not being diagnostic, and it's certainly not me being able to analyse where my learners are at. And I actually think that's one of the big problems that we have now in our schools, that we're not doing enough of that analysis and diagnostic learning. I think that's really important in our professional learning as we go through, so that we are teaching at the points of need. And I see lots of teaching going in there, lots of remediation that is actually not at the point of need. So, you know, we see lots of children who are in remedial groups who are being given remedial programs that are a one-size-fits-all remedial program, when the child can actually do all the information that's in it, that they know all of that. And then we wonder why they lose that need for learning, because they go, I'm bored. I know that people keep putting me in that remediation group, and you know, guess what? I'm over it. I don't want to do this anymore. And I think it's really important that we focus on those elements, and we have those discussions around how we actually, going forward, how we actually really do look at our learners, and how how in a school we actually do analyse, and how we use our analysis diagnostically to actually go back and work with our learners.
Do you think from that, because you've been talking quite a lot about initial teacher education, do you think there's been a decline in literacy standards among teachers?
Among teachers themselves,
Yeah, do you think that because if you're talking about primary and early childhood education, that's where they first come through, and then when you get into secondary, you're hoping and you know that the teachers that have taught them from pre-kindergarten all the way up to year 6 would have hopefully taught them the appropriate and necessary skills needed. Obviously, they're still developing, but do you think that it would start from that early education of the teachers being trained in that literacy area first, or do you think there was something in between that led up into it? I mean, there's a lot of factors, but
I think it's a balance of both. And I think, you know, as Maxine said earlier on, and I think which is really important, our curriculum has changed dramatically over the years as well, and what expectations on teaching and what we have to do in our classroom has changed dramatically over the years. And I think that that's one of the things it's very hard to make that balance. So I think that, yes, I think that for me personally, I would love to see a lot more work in initial teacher education in those early years about how do we start children off on that literacy process and reading and writing, and a lot of that play-based skills about building oral language and vocab, because I actually find that a lot of children are struggling, and I think it's one of the things that we're not actually addressing. You know, we look at our NAPLAN scores, and actually we see that many children, it's actually not even their reading and writing that's actually causing them difficult spelling. It's actually their understanding of words, their vocab. You know, a lot of kids are being let down because of vocab. And I think that this is another really big area that we haven't done enough of. And I think that when we're trying to expedite children into a reading process where we don't have in those early years, and this comes down to not just initial teacher education, it comes down to parents, it comes down to all of us. Are we trying to push children to learn how to read way too quickly and not give them the opportunity to be at school, to start to develop language, to start to look at print around them? And they've been, you know, our kids nowadays are filled with print, but now they've got someone around who can start to, you know, share books with them and look at print and look at patterns in print and start to build up these patterns and so forth. And I think that, you know, that some of the areas that we're lacking in at the moment is that we're getting children into schools and people want them to read really, really quickly. Like, you know, you've got to get one of these, you've got to get a decoded reader, you've got to get these children reading. Whereas for me, I actually think that a lot of reading comes from us being able to share environmental print, build up vocabulary, build up an understanding of books. That doesn't mean they don't read books, but we share a lot of books with them. We look at a lot of phonic patterns. We look at patterns in there with them. And I think that's a very important process of starting this process off right from the start. And I think that from my perspective, that's what we have to look at. Are we pushing children way too quickly into the process of reading without actually using all those other skills like oral language? And we know that oral language is a very strong early predictor of children's literacy success. But if we're not doing that in our initial teacher training about teaching the importance of oral language, the importance of vocab, and that's really important as well. And, and let's face it, our teachers now are a product of the last couple of generations of teachers. So, is it declining? Is it adding to? Our vocabulary has changed dramatically. And what vocab I might understand now, I would not probably understand a lot of the vocab that some of maybe our student teachers might, because they've got a lot of vocab from technology that they understand. So it's always going to balance and change, and we have to be able to deal with that balance and change.
Maxine, sorry.
I don't know the answer. I don't think someone's researched it. Anecdotally, my observation would probably be yes. I just think that if you're in an infants class in particularly, your core business has to be teaching kids to read. And I just want to support Denise in that. Play-based learning is incredibly powerful. I think we've got a lot to learn from the early childhood sector. And the power of oral language and rich vocabulary are the foundations of literacy skills. And you'll often hear many people talk about kids being able to read when they went to school. And I just think, oh God, that's what you send them to school for. So that's what school is about. But learning to read happens in multiple ways, and it happens with really high quality instruction from someone who knows how to teach children to decode and encode, and all of the many things that go into making that. If it was that simple, everyone would be reading. And it's clearly not simple. And I think we're often just talking about a really small yet significant and vulnerable population. And it stems then onto, I think this decline in literacy has largely come about in a little bit of an alarmist way, because we're looking at some of the NAPLAN writing results for teens and their engagement in just writing and how we mark that. And it ties in with all of the things we've been talking about. And I just think that it's never as simple as any one thing. That's why we're having this conversation today. And I was just thinking, as you said earlier, I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I'm already a proficient reader, fortunately, but for a young person, a child or an adolescent in particular who's struggling with the interest in reading, I just think wrapping around or supplementing that the task of reading with anything that will engage them to expand oral language or vocabulary can only be a good thing if the alternative is doing nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And do you think that is the decline also attributable to parental attitudes towards literacy? So we had one of our attendees saying that, is it that parents or carers are not talking and having conversations with young people as much as what we used to? And does this affect their exposure to language itself?
Anecdotally, people will say that. I don't know what the research says. And I think I always keep coming back to, have we got any research to validate this? I think, the most rigorous port of call for anyone who's an educator and a professional is to look at the work by Hattie and co, because that's, he's done a big meta-analysis of high quality research around what's the effect size of things that matter. So I'm sure for every family where there's not rich conversation, there's another family that's having rich conversation. It may well be true that families don't sit around the dining table and talk as much as they used to. Kids are watching things on devices. Yeah, I don't think I'm in a position to comment on that. However, I think the core business we're in is to not blame the teachers as the bad guy or the universities, but still the conversation, and I I'm going to make a bumper sticker out of this and sell it and make a fortune. The big conversation is, what now? So what am I going to do in the time when that child's in my school, in my classroom? What's my school's plan? What am I doing? Because some of those other extraneous things are out of my control. We can encourage those things, but what I do have in my control is what's happening in my school, in my classroom, the professional growth of my staff, my colleagues, and the students in my class, and those families as well. And I always keep coming back to, am I doing the smartest, best thing that I can do? Because busy work isn't always necessarily fruitful work in a place where we need to get this right. And then you alluded to that, Denise, when you're talking about filling in closed passages, which are great and all have their place, as do many other activities. But nothing replaces teaching young people to read. And if they get to high school and can't read, it's no good the high school teachers saying, and I've probably been this person in the past, oh, what was it going on in primary school? Why weren't they taught to read? Someone back there was working really hard to teach them to read, and this kid still got too big for the chairs and had to move along. But the big question comes back to, what now?
And I think
games aren't helpful.
I think that's everything. I totally agree with everything you're saying there. I think that's really great to hear you say, what's happening in my school, my area where I am is so important, because that's where we make a difference, that's what we do. But there is, when we're talking about oral language, and I think something that we have to think about now is our learners, our young learners, before they start school. And it's very interesting. And I went to a really conference where Patsy Solberg was talking, and it was really, really sort of resonated with me because of the number of taking all my grandkids and out there, watch my guys about you, but he's about you as well. But saying, and it's really interesting that we see now that children who are brought up with devices, they're not getting the verbal cues, they're not getting the language, because there's lots of harpics and sounds and so forth that you'll get on an app, etc. Whereas even when children were sitting in front of a video, if you put a child down in front of a video or they're watching television, they're actually getting to see all the facial expressions, they're getting to understand, they're building vocab and so forth as well. So I think that this is something that we really do have to think about. It is a process that as parents we have to think about it, and I think as teachers that we have to think about it. And we are going to have lots of children who come into our schools who are, obviously the digi-age kids that are all coming through now, that perhaps have had parents who've given them, and that's, for many, many reasons, and I don't sort of want to go here, but many reasons, where they will be, given a device and they'll be watching a device, but they won't actually be having those conversations, and they won't even be, it's not even so that they're watching a movie or they're watching they're watching Play School or something like that and getting a whole lot of great conversation happening. So I think it is something that we have to be wary of, something we have to think about, something that we have to think about in schools and when we're talking to parents. And last week I had a great parent afternoon session that the school I was working in Sydney, and one of the big things I said to parents, I said, the most important thing that you can do with your children is actually to have discussions with them and to have to develop their vocab, to talk about words, the meaning of words and things around them. I said, the other things, that's our job at school. I really do believe that that's our job, to do a lot to that, but to build up vocab really takes us as a group, as a family and so forth as well, where we're sharing words, where we understand the meaning of words. And it brings it back, because I had this great time when I had these kids, and I was this group of kids, and we were talking about, on their sheet that they had to do, it had this task number 1, task number 2. And this boy, I was looking at him, he was going like, I can't get what this is, the task that I have to do. And he actually didn't know what the word task meant. Now, we just all thought that the whole class would know what task meant. So I went, who knows what task meant? I think there's about 3 of them that knew what task meant. They could tell me what task meant. And 2 of the kids, which I thought was, one said to me, oh, I thought it was a tusk like an elephant. Now, when they say the word task and tusk, it sounds the same, and they're saying, well, that's the closest word that I know, and they don't understand. And I think if you probably remember, I think it was three 3 years ago now, maybe going forward with all the COVID in between happening, with memory skills there, but it was very interesting because there was a question in NAPLAN that said, if I have a couple of bananas, how many bananas do I have? And literally hundreds of thousands of Australian children failed that question because they said things like 3, 4, 6, and so forth, because they actually didn't know what the word couple meant. You know, now, as I said, if it would be, I'd understand that it was my kids, because no, I'd say to my kids, no, I'll be a couple of minutes, and 10 minutes later I'll be back again. So they wouldn't. But for kids who don't know, you know, people haven't actually explained to them that that's what couple means. Couple actually means two. So children can hear it out there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they understand the meaning of it. So the difference about the number of words that I can speak is very different to the number of words that I actually understand. And this is what comes back down with a big problem we have in spelling. And I say this to parents all the time. You can get children who get 20 out of 20 in the spelling test. They know how to spell a word, but that doesn't mean that they know what that word means and that they're actually going to be able to use it again in another social circumstance, whether or not they're writing, answering a question or whatever else. So it's really important, this whole process of us thinking about, where does language come into this and where does vocab? And that's why oral language and vocab are such important elements for us then to build all the other elements that we need for reading. And as Maxine said, which I think is so important, it's an integrated process. There isn't one process, there isn't one thing you do. It's how we integrate all those processes to work together that's important.
And Maxine, just for us to, as we come close to the end of our webinar already, I know we can keep going all night, but with your team when you work in your context, what are some practical things, even for our listeners tonight, that they could go to help them know? Because, for instance, even for myself, when we're talking about how to implement literacy within our programs, what would be something that you would tell your colleagues or your team that, you know, try to implement it in this way, knowing that you are covering it correctly? What's something that you would try to, in a practical sense?
Yeah, what a great question. Look, I think one of the things when you're doing programming and a faculty's got time to program is use the wisdom sitting in the room, because I think when you put a group of like-minded people together, the answers are there. It's just about making it a priority so that it's a tab on your, wherever you've got your program or something. It's more than writing a list of vocab. It's more than writing a list of words. And Denise, I really enjoyed listening as you talk about, I know the word, I've heard it. The next tier is, I think I know what it means. And the third tier is, I can use this word. It's like tiering words I know, words I've heard, and words I've never heard of before, and I don't even know how to use them. And so all of that is, you know, at the end of the day, it's about using it. I'm just going to make a plug for Universal Design for Learning.
UDLs, yes. Yeah.
So I just think the old UDL, you know, not an alcoholic drink in a can, but that or maybe that. The multiple modes of representation, so the students are getting that diversity of opportunity, multiple modes to engage, multiple modes of action. That model is so powerful for differentiation, and I just think it's at the core of how we then do these things. And I think, you know, teachers will be using these tools, but we need to explicitly name them in programs and track how frequently they use. Mind mapping, incredibly powerful, because you start with a base and you can move on to writing, because if you've got a base of words and ideas, you can write a sentence. If you can write a sentence, you can add another one. You've got a couple of sentences, you've got a paragraph. A few of those, you've written an essay. I know that I'm making it sound simple, but you know what I mean. Scaffolding task, model, exemplary examples. I think these are all things we know. And I think before we go looking for the magic answer that's out there somewhere in research, I think the best practices are here sitting in front of us. It's how we articulate the doing of those things. And so things like pre-assessment, exit tickets, like we know all these things, and we're so cramped for time that we have to, as a team, be very strategic about when to use them. So I've taught this unit of work, or I've had this 2-week block. Have I done an exit ticket? Have I pre-assessed? Have I used a scaffold? Have I used a mind map? Have I got a rubric for the assessment task? Have I put subtitles on the video they watched? right? Have I used an assistive technology like read and write? Have I done speech text, text to speech? These are all these things. But if there are a little checklist somewhere that does a drop down menu in terms of your register, then you're going to be ever mindful of the simple tools that are there, and none of them require whiz bang technology or having to go and read a research paper or train about something. There are lots of great practices that are there that I think we already know. And I think it's an opportunity for me just to say, teachers need a chance to just step back and go, actually, I'm not doing such a bad job. I use all those things. And I'm sure many of you are sitting there thinking that. I just need to be more mindful of when I use it, why I use it, and that they're part of my what now.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Maxine and Denise. And I hand you back over to
Oh,
you,
sorry.
Fred.
Yeah.
Oh,
sorry.
no, Denise,
No,
did you
I
want to
was
say anything?
gonna say, because I think I really love what Maxine was saying, but it was really, and I think that one of the things that I, is very, very sort of important to me is teachers doing cross-curricular work. And I think that people have got to get rid of words like spelling, and we've got to make things and say, instead of let's doing spelling, let's do word study. And that word study comes from across the curriculum. It doesn't matter if I'm doing a word from maths, science, social studies, music, whatever. It comes back down to it's part of my word study. And word study does not stop in the morning at a particular lesson. It goes right across the board. And I think that's important. And so does spelling, so does reading. And I think that that's what we have to really keep in mind, especially as we're trying to lessen teachers' load, is to say, think about how you program, think about what we are doing, and exactly what Maxine said, it's there in front of us. We're doing all of these things, but how we put that together and go, I'm covering this, I'm covering this, I'm covering something else, is really important.
Thank you, Denise. Back to you, Fred.
Thank you, Patrick, Maxine, Denise. On behalf of the Teachers Guild of New South Wales Council, I'd like to thank our distinguished panel, Maxine, Denise and Patrick, for their time and experience in engaging us all on a very informative discussions and the opportunities and challenges on this important topic. So many great strategies of thinking about language and oral vocab elements, and the way how we can integrate this process so important. The Teachers Guild New South Wales thanks you for your friendship and congratulate you on the work you have been leading in making education the vibrant professional association that it is. Thank you. Just in terms of follow-up, the event recording will be sent out along with certificate of attendance and a short post survey to help us shape our future monthly online webinars. Thank you for joining our event, and we look forward to see you at future Guild events. Please stay safe and well.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you.